Hello and welcome back to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are exploring on this week of September 29th, our episode to talk more about George Whitefield and the using his death date of September 30th, 1770, as a kind of a marker for us to be able to talk about the good Reverend and the impact that he had on Christianity, and particularly in the U.S. and as well as within Europe. And so we have our guest today, Dr. Thomas Kidd, who is a church history professor and research history professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. And Dr. Kidd, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, the first lesson anytime we talk about Whitefield is we have to figure out how to pronounce his name, right? You know, I mean, you can
Yeah,
probably tell whether somebody doesn't know if they call him Whitefield. Is that probably right?
it is. Yeah, in fact, just this week I was correcting spelling on Whitfield's name in one of my classes, and you can tell that it was pronounced Whitfield because even in his lifetime, it was often misspelled, without the e in the middle, and so but when it's spelled right, it looks like it's Whitefield, but we know it was pronounced Whitfield.
Absolutely. So give us some just background on him. I mean, did he start off going into the ministry? Was he trained for that? Did he end up there because he was doing something else and that's kind of where he ended up? Or did he start
Yeah,
off that way?
well, he spent most of his life in England, and so he grew up in Bristol, England, and a broken family.
Mm,
His father died when he was very very young, and then his mother did not marry well the second time, and so they were poor, and he worked in a bar for some of his teenage years, serving drinks and cleaning up at a bar, and so not a very promising background, but it was clear he was good in school. He especially had a talent for public speaking,
mm,
and so I do think when they realized how good he was at public speaking and also acting, that he might have some talent that would feed into being a preacher.
mm.
And so his mother and he figured out that there were ways to get scholarships for relatively poor children like Whitfield, and so he was able to get into Oxford University. And usually, when people went to Oxford or Cambridge, those were the two main English universities of the time. Usually, being a pastor was one of the options on the table, like Harvard and Yale at the time. A lot of the people who went to Oxford and Cambridge in the 1730s did end up becoming Church of England ministers. But it wasn't entirely clear for Whitefield, and he was unconverted as a Christian when he went to Oxford.
Oh, okay.
But so it wasn't totally. Maybe he would become a lawyer or work in the government or something like that. But while he was at Oxford is when he got converted, and then that made it very clear that he was going to become a minister.
How about that? But so he was not affiliated necessarily with any particular church at that time. I mean, everybody was Church of England, or could you
Yeah,
be
I mean,
nonconformist then?
the,
Or
the default for everybody in England at the time was that you were Church of England, and if if you were a Baptist or a Presbyterian or something, you were called a dissenter. And then if you were a dissenter, you couldn't go to Oxford or
oh,
Cambridge.
okay.
And so he was Church of England, but that was pretty nominal. I mean, he was baptized as a baby, and went to church, went to a church school, and went to church, but he was certainly not particularly devout or anything until he was converted at Oxford.
About that. So but his early affiliation, where is it from the time then that, because you had to be licensed to preach, right? And you had to be licensed by by the government, right? I mean, and you had to, but that also meant that if you were a dissenter or it wasn't going to go too well. Is that
Yeah,
probably right?
yeah. So So because he was a Church of England, member, and then priest, yeah, I mean, there was a relationship there between the Church of England and the English government, and so he was ordained. You're ordained first as a deacon, and then you become a full-fledged minister. So mid 16, or sorry, 1730s, he receives ordination, and he very quickly, even without an appointment as a local parish minister, he begins preaching a lot publicly, and he just proves to be phenomenally gifted and talented, and we would say anointed in his preaching that it just draws first hundreds and then thousands of people to come hear him preach. And so, one of the reasons he begins preaching outdoors pretty quickly is just simply because there are very few churches that can hold the crowds that are coming to hear him
Really?
preach. Your average, even a large church, doesn't hold more than 1,000 people, and he's got thousands of people who are just pouring in to come hear him preach. And by the late 1730s, he's preaching in London to crowds of tens of thousands of people. And so he goes out to, these large greens in public greens in London, and I mean, there was at least one crowd at Hyde Park in London in the late 1730s, is reported as 80,000 people came to hear him preach, and that may be grossly inflated, but I mean, so what? If there's 40,000 people there, this is one of the largest crowds ever assembled in human history, and so the effect that he has is just absolutely electric.
Wow. And so certainly I would guess then, is it along that period of time that he and the Wesleys connect? I mean, I mean,
So
you draw
they
80,000 people, you might meet a Wesleyan somewhere along the way,
Right,
right? I
right.
mean,
So he knows John and Charles Wesley from his time at Oxford. John is about 11 years older than him, and so John has already graduated and has become an Anglican minister. But of course, they're better known for founding the Methodist movement within the Anglican Church. It's not originally a separate denomination, and isn't for a long, long time. But it's an Anglican renewal movement that is promoting heart devotion to the Lord
mhm,
within the Anglican Church. And there's a lot of nominalism within the Anglican Church because it's the state church. And for a lot of people, if you're baptized as a baby into the Anglican Church, I mean, you're kind of all set. But the Methodists are saying, no, the biblical model is heartfelt devotion to the Lord, evangelism, serving the poor, visiting prisoners in jail. That you really need to be really radically committed to the Lord and to your faith. And so Whitefield encounters that as part of his student days at Oxford, and that's part of the reason why he ends up getting converted at Oxford as a student.
about that. So connecting with them and then becoming more affiliated with that whole Methodist movement. How did that happen, and when did that happen, and how does he end up being over in the U.S.?
So the Wesleys are helping him with, he's saying like, what should I read? Like, give me some, and they're sharing like Puritan classics with him, and just classics of Christian devotion and so forth, and that plays a role in his ultimate conversion that happens in the mid 1730s, and then he starts preaching. But they're also telling him that he should consider going to America as kind of a missionary, at least on a short term basis. And so his first visit to America is pretty brief and goes in around 1737. But then he had already started getting famous as a preacher, goes briefly to America for the first time. But then he is really becoming um, a kind of celebrity preacher by about 1738. He comes back to England. He's drawing these giant crowds like the one in London. And so when he goes to America the second time in the late 1730s, now he's really become famous, and he's more famous than either of the Wesley brothers by that point.
Hmm.
And so when he returns to America, in the late 1730s, there's a lot of media built up for his visit to America, newspaper reports of this kind of boy wonder preacher.
Hmm.
And so he starts attracting, yeah, I mean, there's no city anywhere close to the population of London and America at the time. But I mean, he's attracting crowds in Philadelphia and Boston that are larger than the population of Boston or Philadelphia at the time,
Wow.
because there's so much buildup about what an incredible preacher he is. And whenever he preaches the first time, I mean, he's drawing ever larger crowds after that. And so, he speaks in Boston, and there's 25,000 people there when only 17,000 people live in Boston at the time.
Wow.
So he preaches on Boston Common, and it's just this incredible sensation. This is actually the time in Philadelphia when Ben Franklin gets connected with Whitefield. Now Franklin is no kind of Christian believer. I mean, he
Sure.
he goes to church and so forth, but he's a little skeptical about.
He's a
But
deist at best, right?
yes, well, he calls himself a deist,
Hmm.
but he Franklin realizes as a young printer in Philadelphia that Whitefield is something that nobody has ever seen before. And so Franklin sort of desperately tries to get kind of an exclusive contract to publish Whitefield's stuff.
Huh.
And so by the late 1730s, I mean, Franklin is publishing, Whitefield's sermons, Whitefield's travel journals, which are some of his very best selling materials. But Franklin is also publishing anti Whitefield material. I mean, just anything he can get his hands on. And Whitefield's fine with it. He's just like, more publicity means more exposure for the gospel. And so I'm great with that. And so Franklin ends up partly becoming independently wealthy because he makes so much money off of publishing Whitefield's stuff. And so this is partly part of the reason why Franklin is able to retire early
Hmm.
from printing, because he becomes independently wealthy. And then Franklin goes on to become first famous because of his scientific and electrical experiments. And then ultimately Franklin becomes the most famous because of his diplomatic work for first in Britain and then for the independent American government. But he's set up to be able to do that because he becomes so wealthy as a printer, partly from publishing
Sure.
Whitfield stuff.
Yeah, and if you had to hold down a job, you might not be able to run to France for 3 years trying to
Right.
negotiate or England, either way or the other, for about part of that. Hey, we're enjoying our conversation with Dr. Thomas Kidd, and we're talking about the life of George Whitefield and learning so much great info about them. So when Whitefield comes back during this larger time that we were discussing, he still would we say he is a Methodist at that time, or is he just affiliated with the Wesleys? Is that kind of
Right. So it's until after Whitfield dies that the Methodist Church becomes an independent denomination.
gotcha?
So the Wesley brothers are both denominationally Anglican. Whitfield is denominationally Anglican, but they're part of the Methodist Reform movement within the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so Whitfield would regularly be called a Methodist, as the Wesleys would be called Methodists. So they are part of that early Methodist movement. But in 1739, John Wesley and George Whitefield have a pretty ugly breakup over the differences between Calvinism and Arminian theology, and Whitefield being the Calvinist and John Wesley being an Arminian, free will versus Calvinism.
Hmm.
And so after 1739, John Wesley and George Whitefield pretty much don't have a relationship anymore for at least about 20 years.
Wow, wow. So does Whitefield stay in America, or does he end up going back and forth to
He
England?
goes back and forth, and he crosses the Atlantic a total of 13 times during his
Wow.
life, which is an extraordinary number
Yeah.
for anybody who's not like a sailor or a merchant shipper. It's really unusual, and you could easily die on any transatlantic passage during that time. And Whitfield gets close to dying on a couple of those journeys, but he does end up, even in the 1740s and 50s, when he's kind of at the height of his fame, he's spending most of his time actually in England. But he does spend, a total of, certainly years of his life in the American colonies. And in a way, I would say, he has probably his biggest impact in the American colonies. I mean, by percentage of population, he just has an enormous impact in America. And we think by the end of his life, probably at least about three-quarters of all of the white colonists in America had heard him speak in person. I mean,
Wow.
I mean, and so he has a level of celebrity that is so outsized at his time. I mean, people are surprised when they hear me say this, but we do not have any celebrity in America, uh, who has the kind of level of role that Whitefield did during his time. I mean, who is our biggest celebrity in America today? Taylor Swift just got engaged as we're recording this. But I mean, how many people what percentage of Americans have been to a Taylor Swift concert?
Right.
1%, 2%, maybe, not 75%, right? I mean, so I mean, if 75% of the colonists had seen Whitefield preach live, it's just extraordinary. I mean, nobody had ever seen anything like this before. And so, Whitefield in that sense is, uh, he's arguably the first great celebrity in any field in
Mm.
modern world history. And if that's true, I mean, you think about our celebrity driven culture, that makes him even really significant beyond kind of religious history.
Wow. Wow. That's really a lot. Well, how did he and Jonathan Edwards end up connecting up, and how does that fit into what we all like to refer to as, the First Great Awakening?
So the First Great Awakening in America really starts in Edwards's congregation in Northampton, Massachusetts in the mid 1730s. And Edwards wrote that up and had the faithful narrative of the surprising work of God in Northampton published originally in London. And so Whitefield knew about that revival before he comes to America for his first big preaching tour. And so Whitefield went out of his way in 1740 to go to Northampton.
Oh, okay.
Northampton is kind of a frontier town at the time, but Whitefield really wanted to meet Edwards and his wife, Sarah. And so Whitefield preaches there in the fall of 1740, and it goes really well. Huge results that you see in terms of professions of faith and all this. But he and Edwards weren't totally on the same page. Whitefield made Edwards a little nervous, I think, about
Hmm.
just the fame, the celebrity. Thought it might be getting a little kind of out of control. And Edwards was also just kind of dispositionally more conservative than Edwards was, or I'm sorry, that Edwards more conservative than Whitefield was. And so, Whitefield would talk a lot about, hey, a lot of the pastors preaching today, they're not even converted, right? I mean, they need to be saved. And Edwards is like, okay, that may be true, but like maybe we shouldn't talk about it. It's kind of impolite, don't you think? And so Edwards, even wrote, he said, I think after I corrected Whitefield about those things, he didn't like me so much.
Wow.
And so
How about
so
that?
they had a little tension in their relationship, but nothing like this just terrible breakup that John Wesley and Whitefield did. It's striking that that those are probably the three biggest leaders of the Great Awakening: John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. And between all three of them, there was somewhere between tension and utter breakup in their relationship. And so, when you see preachers, theologians have bad breakups today, I mean, it may be dismaying, but it's not new.
Yeah. Wow, wow, wow. So, so how did you get interested in Whitefield in particular? I mean, let's talk for people who would like to know more about him and like more about his life. You've written a book, right, on that. So,
Yeah.
wave that at the screen. I
Yeah,
was ready
yeah,
to
it's
do that.
George
So,
Whitefield, America's spiritual founding father. It's 11 years old now. I came out for the 300th anniversary of his birth
oh, okay.
in 2014, and I mean, I got interested because, as a Christian myself, I mean, that's the reason I do religious history is just kind of trying to figure out where we came from and where I came from and all that. But I felt like there, on his 300th birthday, there was just room for kind of revisiting, all these issues about he's clearly the most famous pastor in the First Great Awakening. But he's not as well known today as Jonathan Edwards or John Wesley are.
Mm,
And I think that part of that is because his fame is really in the moment. I mean, it's his preaching in the moment. Where Edwards' fame, I think, endures more because his brilliance is captured in his writing. So
mm,
we can read Edwards' works today and see, oh yeah, I mean, I may not understand all this, but I see that this is totally brilliant. And Wesley's importance is as an organizer. So the Methodist
sure.
movement and then the Methodist denomination is all because of Wesley's organizing brilliance. So he leaves the denominational legacy, where Whitefield is the preaching in the moment. And so I wish we had a YouTube clip of Whitefield preaching,
Wow,
and
yeah.
we would just watch that instead of us talking about him. So I felt like it was just a good time on his 300th birthday to just revisit this man. There was some archival work that I felt like could be done, so I went to England and did a fair amount of work there. His papers are kind of all over the place, even in London. So I tried to capture as much as that as I could, and just for this generation, with concerns that we have about celebrity preachers and the effect of media and fame on
Sure.
celebrity preachers, I felt like there was just a lot that could be done with that. So that's what I was shooting for in the biography.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, like Edwards and being connected to, seminaries and universities and people that can go back and say, presidents that can claim, Edwards as their, ancestor and those type, as well as what the Wesleys were able to do in that organization piece. What I'm hearing you say is Whitfield didn't really have that after legacy of being able to say generation upon generation, they were
Yeah,
what
yeah.
Edwards was president at Princeton, right?
At
Or what would
Princeton,
become Princeton?
unfortunately, only for a few weeks because
Yeah,
he got smallpox right after he became president and died. And I mean, and when you read Edwards' writings today, I mean, it's generated, hundreds and hundreds of books about his theology and all this. When you read, I mean, there's plenty of extant Whitefield sermons, and you read them and you think this is very theologically sophisticated, very serious. It doesn't have the brilliance of Edwards' work, but that's an unfair standard. I mean, nobody has the brilliance of Edwards' work. So, um, yeah, I think it's the in the moment. It's there when you're there with 40,000 other people. It's
hmm,
a bit like Billy Graham. I
yeah,
think that it's the power of the preaching in the moment, and especially when you were there live. And Whitefield did have a denomination that somewhat started out of his ministry, the Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Church. Believe it or not,
okay,
a lot of people are surprised that there's a Calvinistic Methodist Church, but there
yes,
and it exists today. But it's pretty well limited to Welsh in Wales and Welsh descendants. But it's never been a very large denomination, and certainly not on the scale of the Wesleyan Methodist movement, which is a global denomination now, and certainly growing in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and everything. So it's taken on a life that John Wesley could have never imagined. But Whitefield hits on themes of evangelism, celebrity preachers, the temptations of fame and power that are really enormously relevant to us today as well.
wow, absolutely fantastic. Thank you for taking time to share with us more about George Whitefield and his impact, and very impactful, right? I mean, that's an understatement for all that we're talking about here when you have that many people that were able to hear his voice, or to be able to at least to be connected to him, and what a great impact all that was. So
Yeah.
thank you for your time. We really appreciate you doing that.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we've enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Thomas Kidd. If you want to know more about the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College, please check us out on our website and all our social media spots, and follow us there as well, and learn more about Christian history, because we hope that the more you know, the more you grow, and that helps you do your however you do sanctification, however you do salt and light, however you understand worship. There's probably some history behind the reason that you're doing that. So that's a large part of what we do every day. Thanks so much for joining us.